The journey of caring for a loved one who is living with dementia can be quite challenging. The aim of this podcast is to make caregiving less daunting and more fulfilling. On this platform, we share knowledge, understanding, and experiences. We enlighten, give hope, and encourage, and in the process create positive awareness about different aspects of dementia. Welcome to my podcast, Dementia Caregivers Corner. My name is Juliah. Dementia Care, how deep is your love?
What happens when someone living with dementia has a moment of clarity? Not just lucidity, but what feels like a true awakening. On today's episode of the Dementia Caregivers Corner podcast, I'm joined by Dan Cohen, an entrepreneur, an author, and a host of the Awakenings in Real Life podcast. Dan shares the extraordinary experience of his father's unexpected awakening in the midst of dementia. A moment that transformed how he understands memory, identity, and presence at the end of life. This is not a clinical conversation, it's dementia as lived through the eyes of a son and a caregiver. We talk about caregiver exhaustion, missed moments, and how awakening, meaning, and connection can still emerge even when hope feels distant. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome in today's episode none other than Dan.
Hi, Julia. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yes, it's my pleasure to have you. It's afternoon on my side. What time is it?
It's in the morning here.
Oh, okay. But we are connected. There's no problem with that.
That's great.
Let's just get into it, Dan. I want you to describe or explain what dementia is. Not as a clinician, not as the dementia expert, but as someone who has lived experience. How would you describe dementia to someone who has never encountered it?
So my father was my hero, my best friend in life. And he was a very big personality. He was very loving. He exuded love. He hugged his children. He was very present in our lives. And he had a stroke 5 months after his 75th birthday party. And the stroke led to his dementia. So as you know, there are many things that can cause stroke. Again, I don't want to necessarily get into the medical issues. Most people are familiar with Alzheimer's. Dementia are the symptoms. And what dementia does is something that gets progressive over time, and it changes the person that you love. So they get to a situation where they lose all their short-term memory. And it runs in stages. There are 7 stages of dementia, even though that's not something that I focused on. My father, in the beginning, he was good. He made a very nice recovery. He was able to drive a car after his stroke. He was present. But over time, the dementia kicked in and he lost his memory. Eventually, he couldn't initiate conversations, maybe said a word or two. He became incontinent. He needed help getting shaved and bathed. And it changed the man that I loved and was such a big personality into someone that was, hardly there and not the same man. So it's very tough because it's almost like mourning a living person that you love. Even though they haven't passed, they're still there, but they're not the same person.
Yes. You mentioned stages. We know there is moderate to severe. Would you recommend that the families should know more about different stages for their loved ones? And if yes, why? If no, why not? And how is knowing or not knowing the stages of dementia of where your father was affected maybe your caregiving journey as a family?
I guess it's up to the individual family. All I can do is share my experience. I wasn't obsessed with knowing the exact stage he was in. I knew from being around him that he was deteriorating over time. It was just my feeling to go to the doctor and say, what stage is he in and what can we experience from these stages was just going to cause more angst and upset and worry about where they are, what they're capable of. So you know it. You know your individual. You know your loved one. You know what stage they're in. I always advise people to try to be in the moment with your individual. And one of the things that I think is very important, and again, I'm not a medical expert, is acceptance because people do get progressively worse. And what people tend to do when they're dealing with someone who has dementia is to challenge them or correct them. So a lot of times, a person with dementia will repeat things, right? Or they'll ask you the same question over and over. And the natural tendency is, oh, I just told you that. Or don't you remember I told you that? And they don't. It's not something that's rational. It's what's going on in their brain. Or you hear people say naturally where they know the stages or not. Oh, my mother or my father or whoever was so much better 6 months ago. I wish they were that condition of 6 months ago. And all it can do is lead you to more frustration, not only with your loved one that's suffering, but with yourself. So I say, give yourself a break. Try to accept where your loved one is and not challenge them because this is not something they're doing on purpose. And by accepting it, okay, it makes it easier for you too because you won't be as frustrated. And look, nobody's perfect. If someone says the same thing over and over, you're going to get upset, but, you do the best you can under the circumstances. So to summarize, it's really up to the individual what they wanted to know. I didn't because instinctively I knew and it wasn't going to change anything knowing the specifics. I'm just curious, what is your feelings on that issue?
Yes, as a professional caregiver, I would really want to know what stage is in. You know why? Because professional caregivers, maybe in a care home or care facilities, as you call them, that side, you are dealing with many people, not just one person. So I feel like when I know what stage they are in, I'll be able to provide better communication, like you just said, that they are going to lose communication at the end. So when they are at a stage whereby they are not able to communicate, I'll just know as a professional caregiver that, okay, I should address them in such a way, not this way, because this is the stage that they are in. And again, I'm going back to what you said, acceptance. Accepting that this is the stage that they are in, and they will need this kind of communication when they are in the last stage or in the beginning stages. That's how I think.
It makes sense. I'll tell you one other interesting thing about gauging my father's dementia. My father liked to go watch the horse racing. He used to take us as kids, and when I had kids, we used to go and we had a fun day. And he was a pretty good handicapper. He would take the racing form and he'd circle what they did in their last few races, how fast they are, the competition. And what happened was over the years, he would circle less and less things on the racing form. So it's crazy. So I knew I knew it from watching him, but just that situation that over time he became not as good a handicapper was indicative of his mental capacity.
So you see how I see it, the way you are describing it. Like when you know your person, there's your loved one. I mean, they bathed you, and now a different case where you just go to work and go back home. You are a caregiver, a professional caregiver versus a family caregiver. I
Right.
guess it will be different in that way. So getting into the gist of this one, this is the main question where we are basing our podcast on. We all often hear then families talking about having their families experiencing moments of lucidity in their dementia. My question is, in your family's experience, you described something far much deeper and you called it awakening.
Right.
What I want to know is that what was your experience like for you and your family? And in the context that we are talking about right now, what do you mean by awakening?
We had an incredible experience with my dad that was very unique. And you're right. You hear stories of people that are in the late stages of dementia. Maybe they don't even recognize you, and all of a sudden they have a moment where they recognize their individual. We had something very different. My father literally woke up for 2 days, 2 full days. So I'll give you some background. There's something called terminal lucidity, where right before someone dies, they have like they become themselves and they die 2 days later. This is not what this was. This was 8 months before he passed. So he was in the hospital for pneumonia. He was in the hospital for 10 days and he was treated. And then he went in the hospital again for pneumonia. And they infused him with antibiotics and high dose steroids. And my brother's also a doctor, and his partners take care of him. So he was at the hospital when my father was there more than I am. But I'll share my experience. So I went to visit him, and he says, "Hi, Danny." That's what he called me. And I said, "Hi, Dad." And he says, "I love you very much." And I said, "I love you too." And then he says, "What happened to me?" And I said, "You had pneumonia, you're being treated, and hopefully you'll get better." And then it dawned on me that this is a different person. This man was not initiating conversation. He was practically nonverbal. He didn't really know us all the time. And if you spoke to him, maybe you get a word or two. He literally became almost the man he was prior to his dementia. And if I had to put it in percentages, I would say he was 90% the man he was. My brother didn't put it in percentages, but says the bar was so low that he came back so high that it was an incredible moment. And if you want, I could share some of the things that happened during those 2 days. So the whole family came, my mother, my sister, we all came. So my father at one point told my brother that he's happy to have a son like him. And my brother had not heard those words in 10 years, and it was an incredible emotional experience for him. He told my mother and they were married 62 years at the time, that she was the love of his life, and he was so happy to have her in his life. My father had some quirks. So when he used to take a nap, he used to put a long sock over his eyes. I don't know if that's old school. At one point, he says to my mother, "Do you have my sock so I could take a nap?" This was something he hadn't done in 10 years. My father was always a very generous man. So, like, we went to restaurants, he was a very nice tipper. He showed his appreciation by tipping. So my mother's there one day is with him during this 2 day period, and he said, her name was Arlene, "Do you have some cash?" He wanted to tip the nurses and the aides that were so nice to him. I mean, it was just his character. He asked about his grandchildren, and we told him about his grandchildren. And he asked about, here's another interesting thing. He asked about one was in medical school and one was in Ivy League school. And these are events that happened when he was in the throes of dementia. So how did he know that? And that's another thing we could touch upon in a minute. He reminisced about his career as a boxer in the Army, saying, and his favorite sports football player, who was, I know it's not soccer, and it's football. that his favorite player was a very undersized player that shouldn't have made it to the professional leagues, but the guy was a fighter, and he compared himself, and he says, I was like him as a boxing. My opponents were underestimated, and that's why I took advantage of it. And he reminisced about the picture we took of all the grandchildren. He bought them this player's number 80 jersey that they all wore in the picture. So it was really remarkable, the whole experience. But what really said something very important to me. So my children wanted to see their grandpa the way they remembered him. And unfortunately, I couldn't get them in time because after the 48 hours, he reverted back to the full-blown dementia. But my brother had videotaped a part of him. And we have a lot of it on tape. And at one point, he says, what are you happy about? And we showed this to my daughter. He says, I'm happy just to be here and alive. And we felt I in particular felt that was very profound. And if you want to know, I'll tell you why I think it's so profound.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, what my father was saying in that moment was that even in the throes of dementia, you don't know what's going on in the brain of someone that has dementia, right? We never really know.
Mm-hmm.
So my brother thinks the fact that he knew certain things in the dementia that happened while he was saying, maybe they're more aware of what we really expect. How would he know that one grandchild was in medical school and another in an Ivy League school? But for me, when he said, I'm just happy to be here and alive, he was saying, even in the throes of dementia, I appreciate life and want to live.
Mm.
And for my family and I, that was an incredible message. He was a fighter his whole life, and he showed his will to live.
Mm-hmm.
I found the experience, Julia, so profound at the time. I'm a little bit of a writer. As you know, I just wrote a book, but at the time I wrote an article about the experience. And to date, it has over 300,000 views. It's on medium.com. But I've gotten responses from families and caregivers of Alzheimer's and dementia patients that my father's message still gives them hope that their loved one still wants to live and still appreciates life. And I got such beautiful message to me that it tells me that maybe my father's message was more than just for the family, but in a sense, maybe we could help other people out there. So it was really remarkable.
Yes, I'm smiling when you mentioned that your brother managed to capture that on film, because I'm going to have a chat with someone from the US as well. She teaches people on how to capture moments of their loved ones and the importance of that. You see, so that is why I was smiling that at least there's something on camera for your family. So tell me, Dan, dementia caregiving is so much stressful. Apparently, dementia caregivers experience more burnout and stress compared to caregivers of other illnesses. In your case, you were fortunate enough for your father to be in that lucid moment for 2 days. And I mentioned earlier that others can take some few seconds, that the lucidity will take 2 seconds and they're gone. I want you to share with us, how can caregivers be alert enough to recognize such moments when they happen? Because you see, they're always stressful. I'm tired. This has to be done. There are a lot of things that I need to do as a caregiver. I'm tired of being asked the same question again and again, you see. So how can they stay awake? How can they stay alert to experience such moments, especially if they're short and they're brief?
Yeah, that's interesting, is because certainly as a caregiver, you can get overwhelmed by what you're experiencing. Now, our situation, it just was very self-evident, and we spoke to his neurologist. He never saw anything like it in 30 years of practice. My brother spoke to colleagues. They never saw anything like it. So this was really remarkable. But like you say, I'm sure other people experience those moments. So I think it goes back to two things. I think, again, is acceptance of where your person is. And the other thing that I am preach is inclusion. And I think for any caregiver, and I think this will relate to recognizing those moments, is to not treat your loved one or your dementia patients as if they're not in this world or that they're in their own world. Because it's easy to think that, but it's to include them in your life. So I tried, I would go weekly or every other week, and I would take my mother and my father out to the movies. Okay. And as you know, as you go through the stages, it affects you physically as well. So it was very hard to get him in and out of the car, in and out of the wheelchair. And I knew that 3 minutes after we left the movie, he wouldn't remember it. But there were moments, especially before we got really towards the end, where I could see in the moment. I could see, especially if it was a sad movie, I could see the emotions on his face, even though he wouldn't remember it afterwards. So I think that if you include your loved one, either as a caregiver or as a family, in your activities as your best you can, then you will be able to notice more those moments of lucidity because you won't be so worrying about, oh, I got to give him a sponge bath. I got to change him. I got to feed him. Because in a sense, it's doing things that you did before the occasion. So if you include them more in your life, I think you'll recognize faster those moments because you won't be so overwhelmed by the caregiving process.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm smiling again. I supported a lady who lived with vascular dementia, and the family used to do the same. They would take her to all the places that she's been to, and her well being would change. When we come back to the house, she seemed more alive because we've been out. They have taken her to the graveside, maybe of husband's graveside. They've taken her to the house that she was born in, all those things. So, yes.
Sure, being in, including them. And again, we don't really know exactly what they're going through. I, in a support group, saw someone write, and I understand the sentiment. And he wrote, isn't it wonderful that they're in their own world, and let's let them enjoy that world. And I understand the sentiment, but I don't agree. I think you should include them in our world. And I'll tell you a story from my family. So my mother had to go to Texas for a family occasion and for 3 nights. So my brother, sister, and I all came over to watch my father. Okay. And we all took him to a movie on 3 consecutive nights. The next time we're together, they said, what movie did you take Dad to? And this is about 10 or so years ago. And I said, Argo. That was a movie with Ben Affleck that won the Academy Award, right? And then I said to my brother, what movie did you take him to? We took him to Argo too. And then my sister said, yep, we took him to Argo too. And we all cracked up and we started laughing and we said, that's pretty funny because he didn't remember from night to night. But I'll tell you something. When I left my siblings after that and I was by myself, I started to cry because I said to myself, oh, sure, he enjoyed being with us, but we were allowing him to be in his own world. If we were acceptance of where he was and included him, we'd have taken him to 3 different movies. So it made me sad, even though it was funny, we took him to the same movie. At the same vein, it made me sad because we were just thinking, really, not that we knew because we didn't coordinate with each other, but maybe we should have. It didn't matter, but yeah, it mattered. It still mattered. It still mattered. So that's just a quick story that happened to us.
Yes, it's there in your book, right? Earlier, you mentioned that your dad said that he valued the life that he was in the midst of dementia.
Right.
Yes, with hindsight, did you notice any signs that says, yes, really, my dad is okay, has accepted this, and is okay living in this life, in the dementia life. Like, were there any signs or any activities that he enjoyed, or any maybe movies or songs that when they come through, they made him smile?
Yes, that's true. So I'll tell you a story. Again, my father loved horse racing, and we went a lot of times. And I lived in New Jersey. My parents were in New York. It's about a 2 hour trip, and they would come out 2 or 3 times a year. So when he was in the latest stages he had, out of nowhere, he said, I want to go to the track. That's what he called it. And I said, okay. And I knew 3 seconds later he wouldn't even remember he asked me. But again, my philosophy is to include him. And my mother wasn't driving out anymore because she was getting older. So I had to drive 2 hours from New Jersey to New York, pick them up, go back to. I decided to do it because it was something that he enjoyed. So my kids went, my mother and father went, just like we did all the years. And my father, typically, when we would go to the track, there was always one race. He felt very strongly that he knew the winner of the horse. It usually turned out to be the best horse, but over the years, he would win 6 out of 10 times. So we get there, and it's a first race. And like I mentioned earlier, he couldn't read the racing form at all. Towards the end, he could see the odds on the horses. He couldn't do that as all. He just picked a number. So he picked number 7. And my mother chimes up. She reads from books because he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's the long shot in the race. And my son said to me, Grandma, when Grandpa thinks a horse in particular is going to win, he's going to win. And I said, yeah, Mom, we're going to bet that horse. So instead of putting $2 on the horse, we put $10 on the horse, right? So the horse is going, the horse is in last place. We're all there. My father's looking, and the horse is losing the whole race. And at the end, it makes a tremendous comeback and wins by a nose. And we're all cheering. There's not a lot of emotion on my father's face. But my son says, Grandpa, your horse won. And the biggest smile came on his face. And he said, that's great. I knew in that moment he was still there. And just that moment made it worth it for the time back and forth because he was there in that moment. It showed me that he was still there because he would have loved that, the longest horse coming in first. And I'll tell you one other thing was important to me, how I knew. This is a man, I said, that exuded love, especially for his children. So towards the end, when I would go visit, and he'd be sitting in the chair, and who knows what he could compliment on the TV, he would see me, he would take my hand, he'd put it to his mouth and kiss his hand. And that was the essence who he was. So there were always these moments throughout that he showed who he was. I mean, there was a certain point he was speaking in like a gibberish language. We don't know where that came from. So we used to joke around, where did that language from? And then he would say something funny because he was a funny man. So there are always signs, like you said, if you take the time to recognize it, it's going to make everybody feel better.
Talking about family, being there at the race and being together, I want us to talk about your own family. I've come across cases whereby when there's someone who lives with dementia in the family, sometimes it puts so much pressure on the family that some of the families disintegrate to a point of no return. Some families, they come together. So I want to know about your own family. How was your relationship like before your dad was diagnosed with dementia? And how was it as a family during dementia care and after? Did you come together, guys? Did it separate you? Did it break, or you experience both?
So I have an older brother who's a doctor. So he got very involved from a medical point of view. And I have a younger sister, and I'm the middle child. I used to joke around that I was the deprived middle child. He was the doctor, and they looked to him for everything. And our family had a lot of boys throughout the generation. My daughter was the princess. I was the forgotten one. But, so we got different personalities and we had all our own lives. But, we got together for family occasions. We're close. But when he experienced this, or when we experienced it, it really brought us closer as a family. It did not tear us apart at all. We were all there. And here's the interesting point, not only for my father, but my mother. I mean, my mother was the one who was living with him every day. And you know what's interesting, Julia? And I don't know if you've experienced, she seemed to be the last one that recognized all the stages he was going through. And at some point, she always felt he could do more than he could do. I wonder, was it just a denial thing? Or I wonder why that was. Or, because he was such a big personality, he was a great problem solver. Maybe she still looked at him that way, but she was maybe the last one to accept everything. But we made sure that, we had time for her too. And it wasn't just about my father, because if you only focus on him, right, then for the person who's feeling it the most, it won't be good. So we did come together. And after he passed, we became close. We stayed close. But, you're not in each other as much as when they're going through it. My father was hospitalized a little number of times. And there were times we thought, my brother, the doctor, would say, well, his organs are failing. We're not sure he's going to make it through the night. And miraculously, he did. So we've gotten back to our ordinary lives. But I think the experience has kept us closer. And the interesting thing is my father passed away 10 years ago, and my mother passed away a year ago, but we were very involved with her care too. So as a family.
You've just recently released your book titled The Awakenings in Real Life.
Right.
Also have a podcast of the same name.
Correct.
Yes. So on your podcast, Dan, you feature people who have experienced awakenings in code.
Right.
Yes, from addiction, from, the list is endless. What I want to know is what common themes do you see emerging across their stories? And how do their stories resonate with your listeners?
So I'll just tell you quickly how I came to the podcast, because I wasn't planning on doing a podcast. And if you want, afterwards, I'll talk a little bit about how the book came up. But the podcast, we experienced it with my father. I wrote the article and I've since written a book. But I saw a story on TV about a man who had a serious physical condition. He decided to leave his everyday life and sail across the Pacific Ocean. And his story went viral. And it showed a lot of courage and fortitude and and he wasn't a sailor and how to do it. And I said to myself, wow, that man had his own awakening, his own realization. And I said to myself, there must be other people who have had other types of awakening stories, and maybe now I could share it. People typically think of an awakening as something spiritual or religious awakening, but awakening, if you look up the definition, is really a realization, recognition, or awareness of something, or literally a getting up. Like my father had a literally getting up from his dementia. And I said to myself, I bet you there's some tremendous stories to share, and I'd like to share them. I'm interested in the stories. I think I'm a good conversationalist. So I started to look for podcast guests that had their own kinds of stories. And what they all have in common is they're what I call inspiring stories of transformation, meaning, and hope. So the thing they all have in common is they overcame something and made it on the other side. So I had a gentleman who was bullied his whole life. Okay. And later in life, he had an awakening. He became a humanitarian clown, interesting, by the name of Bullseye. So I thought it was great. And he went from someone who wanted to be unseen, being bullied, to being seen. And now he helps people all over the world. I have someone who lost their child, their son at 16 years old. And their awakening was that he wanted to share his experience with the world on the trauma he went through and what you can do to help overcome grief. I've had people that have experienced all kinds of trauma, whether it's sexual abuse or addiction, and how they got through their lives to the other side. Some have become coaches. One woman became a beauty queen, and her platform was to help other people. So I share these stories, like yours is about dementia and caregiving. Mine can touch on a whole lot of different topics, but the theme they have in common is triumphing. And their awakening is usually there's a moment, and it doesn't have to only be a light bulb moment. Some people have a light bulb moment, but it could be an awakening over time. So I share these stories. One woman who lost her father 10 years ago, and she was an atheist, and she had an awakening to say, but she so wanted to connect with her father. She wanted to see if there was life after death. So I have just really some really incredible stories. I have a Holocaust survivor who his awakening was later in his life. He decided that he wanted to do something to educate the public about the horrors of the Holocaust so it doesn't happen again. So that's what these stories are about. And it is called Awakenings in Real Life. And you could find it wherever you find your podcasts, on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. And I think people will find the stories very interesting and have meaning, and maybe will give some inspiration in their own life.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. And then talking about your book, same title.
Right.
As I was scanning through your book, I've realized that you left some empty pages for reflection for your
That's
readers.
right.
And I was like, why did you include an empty page for reflection?
So more recently, I always knew that I wanted to write a book about my father's story. I had written an article that had so resonated with people. And I said to myself, I don't think that's enough to write a story. But when I started to think about it, reflecting upon my father's awakening, right? It, in a sense, woke me up too. So you'll see above the title, I say, My Dad's Awakening from Dementia Woke Me Up Too. It allowed me to reflect upon my life with my father, family experiences, and things that in my life that I almost called mini awakenings, or learning certain lessons in life that have meaning and hope. You see the relationship to the podcast, but it woke me up to things in my life. So I reflected upon things like, for instance, my father was a great problem solver, okay? And sometimes he can make things that seemed impossible possible. He always stood up for his children. If they were bullied, he stood behind us. We have stories of my uncle who was always there, the importance of showing up for your family. There's a story about a gentleman we went also at the racetrack that showed us incredible kindness when my father was going through the dementia, in terms of driving us back and forth to the entrance and helping me in and out with the wheelchair. So I reflected on these stories, and they all showed me something in my life. And then I said to myself, I think that the reader, and a part of it is also to reflect on your caregiving. That's a big part of it too. Not only other aspect of your life, but what helps you as a caregiver, right? So I write that I remember my father more as the man he was rather than the person at the end of his life. And I allow people to reflect on their moments, similar experience with me, and I give them those pages with lines that if they want to write it down, they could write it down and share it with their families. So when I talk about acceptance, right, I say, what's a moment where you accepted your loved one for who they are, and how did that make your caregiving easier? What's a moment of inclusion that you included your loved one to make it easier? We can remember the person as they are now, or remember them at a different time when they were stronger. Can you reflect upon those moments? So after each chapter, I give the reader the ability to reflect on it, and I welcome them to share those with me, and I'll put it on my website. Because like you said before, how do you remember those moments of clarity? Okay. So it doesn't always have to be a moment of clarity, but it could be a reflection of, to give yourself some grace in the caregiving process that you can reflect upon. So that's what I try to do. I try to bring the audience in so they could also feel a part of the book, because the story's about my family, but everybody can relate to an aspect of it in their own family.
Definitely. My mind is just running around. I'm thinking, say I'm a family caregiver and I'm holding your book. At the moment, like my loved one is still alive. Would it be easier for me to reflect when they are still alive, or I can only reflect when they are gone? That's what is just running around in my mind.
You know what? I would urge you to reflect while they're still living. So I have a chapter in a book called A Living Eulogy for My Father. So, everybody's gone to funerals. I've gone to funerals. I've lost my parents, loved ones. I lost a close friend. And sometimes it's, a friend's parent or people you don't know that much. And I'm always brought to tears when I hear eulogies, whether I knew the person or not. And then all of a sudden it struck me. I'm saying, wow, the person that should be hearing this is the person that's passed. So I urge my readers to share your feelings with your loved ones while they're alive. And don't wait till they pass to prepare a whole beautiful speech. So it's living in the moment, and it's being reflecting in the moment and sharing those thoughts. Now, if you're caring with someone with dementia, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you shouldn't reflect on their life and tell them how you feel and share how you feel, because like we're saying, hopefully they're getting more than you might think. And reflecting on, while they're still living, who they were as a person, and I just think it makes it easier to handle the situation, because they are the same person. They're just going through something terrible, a terrible experience. But there are those moments. But even if there's not those moments, I want to believe they know a lot more that's going on. So reflect about the happy times. You're going to listen. I heard your podcast with the woman talking about grief and preparing for grief. Grief is, I'm 10 years in, and I cry all the time, and there's going to be plenty moments of reflection. But reflect while your person's still alive. But for anyone in your life, doesn't only have to be the caregiver who it is. Write the person in your life a letter, do a video, do an email, share what you think about them, be in the moment.
Yes. I guess I think the same way as we reflect about our own lives, right?
Right.
I'm still alive. I'm reflecting on, oh, okay, after I'm finished with this podcast, I sit down and I'm like, okay, okay. So that the next podcast, I do it better than this one. Yeah.
Right. You always got to learn and improve. I'm sure as a caregiver, nobody's perfect. You learn from various experiences. But to me, the thing is to treat, if I had I don't want to use the bottom liners, but treat the person you're caregiving for as the person you loved and remembered. They're going through a horrible thing, and you're going through a very difficult task. But that to me is the important thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we wrap up, is there any question that you thought I should have asked you that will add value to our conversation and help our listeners?
No, I think you've done a great job. I think we've covered pretty much everything. I would love your listeners to listen to my podcast too. I think they'll find really some fascinating people and help them. And I think my book can help them too, because it tells more than just the story of my father's awakening, but allows everybody to reflect on different things in their life that can help them with their caregiver in moving forward, to allow them to maybe look at some things when you look at it one way, a different way that maybe can give more hope. So you covered it very nicely, Julia. You're doing a great job.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So where do we get hold of your book?
So my book is on Amazon. You can go to Amazon, Awakenings in Real Life, a memoir by Dan Cohen. It's also on other platforms and in select bookstores and the like. So that's very easy to find if you just put in Awakenings in Real Life by Dan Cohen. And the same thing with the podcast. It's Awakenings in Real Life. You see, there's a common theme throughout. And then right now I've only dropped 4 episodes, and the book just came out last week. So everything's in the infancy. And I so appreciate the opportunity of being here. And maybe I can return the favor, and you could be on my podcast and share the awakening moments you've seen as a caregiver. I think that would be great.
That would definitely be great. Yes, I'll take that offer. Thank you very much. Let me take this time and thank you, our dear listeners, for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed our conversation with Dan, or you are passionate about dementia care, please consider leaving a review and sharing this episode with someone who might benefit from it. This really helps us to raise awareness about dementia-related issues. Until next time, thank you for listening and bye for now.
Dementia care. How deep is your love?